With a band that's been rapidly evolving, such as Opeth, it's always interesting to find out what they're going to be pumping out next. And for this one, it's been a little bit of a splitter between fans, but really, when has an Opeth album not been? Let's dive into their next effort. Sorceress by Opeth. So Opeth is one of my favorite death metal groups and was actually the group that got me into death metal. They were one of the first to really master the arts of that technical death metal prog music. And now we're coming into their 12th album. I didn't go in expecting anything because the past few albums that they have released just went completely in a different direction than what I was expecting. So I went in not really expecting too much. And each new song that they drop, I actually stayed away from and I avoided. I went into this album last week not hearing a single note off of it. And I think it benefited the overall enjoyment of the album because I didn't come in with any ideas of what the album should sound like. And so what do we actually have on Sorceress, this new album that dropped from Opeth? Well, it is another shift in style. Not quite the same extreme that we had from Watershed to Heritage, and not such a maturity that we saw from that switch between Heritage to Pale Communion. This shift is probably a little bit more subtle and a little bit more thought out. Here, the songs are definitely heavier than we expected from Pale Communion, but it's not quite as impactful and not quite as heavy-hitting in a sense. The songs themselves don't quite progress as much, and there's not quite as much complexity within the songs. But what we do find is a maturity found within Michael's singing. When he ditched the growls, he spent a lot more time really maturing and almost like a good wine, fermenting that voice of his to polish it off. And so that is one of the highlights on this album. So getting into the album as a whole, I love how the album is opened with the concept of Persephone. That story bookending the album, because a lot of the songs on here go to that mythology of Hades and the underworld and the devil. And I mean, that is something that we've seen in Opeth a lot of times before. But being a little bit more subtle and a little bit more not quite in your face plays to the advantage of the album because it gives you a little bit of extra thought throughout it. It brings us right into that first song of Sorceress. And I will admit, when I first heard this song, I loved it. I loved right from the get-go, we are presented exactly what this album means to be. It's a little bit more subtle, it's a little bit more heavy, and it's much more dark than we're used to. And so I love that it just starts off with just the foundational instruments. And then once we come into the actual theme of the song of Sorceress, when the guitars just pick up, I don't know, there was just something inside of me that just got really, really giddy. That darkness that we have with such a minimalistic approach. It was such a great kind of a contrast to the opening of the song, which was very technical with the use of the organs, the bass, and the drums. And now we have a very simplistic kind of main theme of the song. A great way to kind of, I don't know, usher us into what to expect through the overall album. And it was actually at this song where I started to realize that this song didn't actually go too far out from where it had plunked itself down within the first couple of minutes of the song. There wasn't that usual wandering of the land that we saw from Pale Communion and a lot of the earlier Opeth stuff. This was more of like the Heritage style where we have the theme, we have kind of that opening, and we'll play around with it a little bit, but we're not going to get too far out of that box. I actually kind of like this. I like the fact that this song of Sorceress, and a lot of the songs on this, don't really move too far within the songs themselves, but where we do find a very complexity of the arrangements is the differences we have between the songs. And that's actually showcased within the next song of the Wildflowers. And again, we have the song starting off with a very heavy kind of a chugging guitar leading us through the song. But what I like is a lot of the backgrounds that we have, a lot of those extra flourishes that only really make themselves known after 3 or 4 or even 5 listens through. The ones that I like are kind of the use of the synthesizers within this. And of course, I love within Wildflowers just the build up that we have with that guitar. Right near that midpoint, we have a very lonely guitar on the center stage there. And finally, we come to Will of the Wisp. And this was the final track that they released as a teaser to the album. And Will of the Wisp is definitely a more subtle and somber approach. It's much more of a personal track with just the acoustic guitar being the center stage. We saw this approach a lot with the Damnation album, and I like that slow build that this song has. It never really, beats you over the head with those blasting beats or anything like that, but we do have a very crisp and a very clear electric guitar ushering us out of the song. And so the presentation of this was spot on, and I love the orchestration. I love that it doesn't really go too far out and too in your face, but what it does do is it provides you with a great breather between some really heavy tracks. And speaking of heavy tracks, we have Chrysalis, and Chrysalis reminds me of something that we would find on Watershed. And this is where Mike is really showcasing his vocal skills on this song. He's belting it out something fierce here, to an extent that I don't think he has quite before. He has reached this point very selectively, but this is almost all the way through. And what I love about this track isn't necessarily those chuggings that we have, but those flourishes between the chugging areas. You have dun 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 dun, and that's definitely more of a 70s technique. And I know Mike has been very influenced by that metal of the early metals. Kind of taking a look back and then applying it to a modern tinge was a great way to present this song. And I also like the fact that they chose to do kind of a fade out, subtle ending of this song. Even though the whole song up until the end has just been a powerhouse, I felt like having it end on a somber note was needed because of all the energy that it took to get us to here. And it actually led into a great transition into Sorceress 2. So with Sorceress 2, it's a great kind of breather that we have where it's just a very lonely guitar that we saw within Will of the Wisp. And what I really like is the vocal techniques that Michael was using in post-production there. Very akin to almost a Peter Gabriel within The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, where there's some after effects being used on the vocals that I didn't really pick up on until probably the second or third listen through. That blends very, very well within the Seventh Sojourn, and if that kind of a flair was found within the Ghost Reservoirs and Heritage, this one is where that kind of solidifies. It sounds like Mike has almost reached through those 2 albums and brought it back onto this. And I like how it builds. This reminds me of especially a track that was on Ghost Reservoirs, but it gives us a time to just get into the music, kind of get into a mellower track, until we get ushered into Strange Brew. I know many have claimed that this is their favorite track, and I can completely see why. Mike's vocals on that track, once we get over that initial oomph and then we come back down, that guitar work with those vocals, it's just so passionate and so raw and so energetic that it's hard not to be moved at that point. The next song, Of a Fleeting Glance, I like where this song goes, and I really love the ending of this song. It's very crisp and very clear and a little bit different from the rest of the album as well. And we're coming into the kind of closing track of Era, and Era took what I love from Sorceress, The Wildflowers, and A Strange Brew, and really brought it to the forefront. I love the energy that's on this track. Martin's playing on the drums there really usher us through. He is providing the heartbeat of this, and everybody playing on time on this track as well, where it's so quick. It's reminding me of one of the last tracks that we had on Heritage, but without being so cringe-worthingly cheesy. These guys are taking a little bit more of a serious tone on here, and I think it's paying off. But I do like how this kind of brings it full circle. The band opened the album up with a very subtle, soft track that then ushered us straight into a really heavy and hitting track. And we're seeing the same thing here with Era. It's almost a very well spherical album where the final two tracks are that very heavy hitting, very in your face, unrelenting oomph song, which then goes into the reprisal of Persephone's Slight Return, kind of bringing the album all the way to a close. So yeah, that is the album, and I will have to applaud Opeth for such a great addition to their musical discography. I can see quite a number of die-hard Opeth fans that love that brutality and technical skills and that guttural playing being disappointed with this album. I will admit, the first 2 or 3 listens that I had of this album, I myself was a little bit disappointed. But I do love the fact that the more I listened to it, the more I got out of it, and the more I started to grow on this album as well. And that's what I love. I love an album that surprises me. One that when I first listened to, I think, okay, not quite what I was hoping for, but it's alright. And then the more I listen to it, the more I think, you know, I like what they did. I really like this direction that they decided to go in. And so for that reason, I have to say, pick up this album. I highly, highly recommend picking this guy up. So yeah, that's my take on this. What did you guys think of Opeth's new album of Sorceress? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, let me know by commenting below. Thank you guys so much for watching. This one was a little bit harder to put out just because I wanted to get enough time on this album to get me comfortable enough to actually talk about it. Thank you guys again so much for watching. You guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.